All right, buckle up, because today we are diving deep into one of the most famous showdowns in American political history,
Yeah.
the Lincoln-Douglas
The
debates.
Super Bowls of their time.
Okay, you got me. Super Bowl might be pushing it.
No, I'm serious. Think about it. No radio, no television.
Just these two guys,
Hmm.
duking it out in town squares across Illinois.
Precisely. People traveled for miles to witness these debates firsthand. Newspapers printed every single word.
These things were huge.
Absolutely massive. And they weren't just some dry policy discussions either. These were blockbuster events full of drama.
And that's what we're here for, right? The drama.
Oh, we're going to get into it. Today, we're focusing on a particularly juicy slice of the Freeport debate in 1858, where Lincoln and Douglas really went head-to-head over slavery.
Which, let's be honest, was the issue of the day.
No doubt about it. And this debate, it's not just about policy, it's about strategy. We see Lincoln trying to walk this incredibly fine line, balancing his personal views on slavery with the realities of getting elected.
And Douglas, he's caught between a rock and a hard place, trying to keep both his Southern supporters and his Northern voters happy. Talk about high stakes.
It's a political chess match. So, to set the scene, it's 1858, tensions over slavery are reaching a boiling point, and Lincoln and Douglas are in a fierce battle for a U.S. Senate seat in Illinois.
And this Freeport debate, the second in the series of 7, is where things really heat up.
This excerpt in particular is fascinating. It's not just what they say, but how they say it. We see their personalities, their ambition, and their political maneuvering on full display.
Give us the play-by-play. What went down?
So in the previous debate, Douglas had tried to put Lincoln in a corner.
He put out a press release.
No, he challenged him publicly, hit him with these 7 very pointed questions.
Oh, got it.
Designed to paint Lincoln as a radical abolitionist, which was a risky move in those times.
So, what does Honest Abe do?
Well, in this excerpt, Lincoln skillfully turns the tables on Douglas. It's brilliant, really.
Ooh, I love a good twist.
Oh, this is a good one. Lincoln starts by answering those 7 questions head-on, but
There's always a but.
always.
Mhm.
And this is key. He doesn't stop there. He then throws a curveball by insisting that Douglas answer a set of questions in return.
Ooh, that's bold. Did Douglas try to get out of it?
You bet he did. But Lincoln, he's not letting him off the hook that easily.
This is Lincoln's chance to put Douglas on the spot, right?
Exactly. And he doesn't miss it. This is classic political maneuvering. Remember, Douglas is a renowned debater, a national figure.
And Lincoln is using Douglas's own tactics against him.
And it sets the stage for some seriously revealing exchanges. We'll dig into those right after this break. So Lincoln, he wastes no time cutting to the chase.
Weigh it on me.
He zeroed in on this idea of popular sovereignty.
Which, if memory serves, was all about letting the people in a territory decide whether or not to allow slavery.
You got it. Sounds simple enough on the surface.
But we are talking about the 1850s here. Nothing about slavery was ever simple back then.
You're telling me this idea of popular sovereignty, it was a powder keg, really. And Lincoln, he knows exactly how to expose the hypocrisy at the heart of it.
Hypocrisy? Do tell.
Oh, it's juicy. Lincoln, he hits Douglas with this question. Can a territory exclude slavery before it becomes a state?
I see where you're going with this.
Because if they can't, then all this talk about popular sovereignty, all that power to the people stuff, it kind of falls apart, doesn't it? At least for folks who are against slavery.
Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place. How does Douglas respond to that?
Well, he tries to have it both ways, says, yes, technically the Constitution might give a pass to slavery in the territories.
But
Always a but. He insists folks living there can still keep slavery out, practically speaking.
practically speaking,
Yeah.
what's he hiding behind that phrase?
He's talking about passing what he calls unfriendly legislation, basically making it such a pain in the neck to own slaves that no one would even try.
Ugh. Yeah. A loophole. And I bet everyone listening knew exactly what Douglas was doing. So much for popular sovereignty.
Pretty much. But you got to remember, Douglas is in a tough spot, trying to hold together a Democratic Party that is literally tearing itself apart over this issue of slavery.
Trying to keep those Southern Democrats happy. You know, the ones who want slavery to expand without alienating Northern voters who are increasingly against it.
A real balancing act. But here's something that's been bugging me. Douglas keeps calling Lincoln a radical abolitionist.
Yeah, which, from what we've heard of Lincoln's responses so far, doesn't seem entirely accurate. What's Douglas playing at here?
It all comes down to strategy, my friend. See, Douglas knows that here in Illinois, being seen as anti-slavery is good for his image. But he also knows that going too far, Being too extreme could cost him the support of those Southern Democrats he desperately needs for his national aspirations.
So what's the plan?
He does what any savvy politician would do. He creates a false dichotomy. It's either Douglas the moderate or Lincoln the radical abolitionist.
Clever. By exaggerating Lincoln's position, he makes himself look more reasonable by comparison.
Exactly. It's textbook political maneuvering. But here's the irony.
Get me with it.
By constantly painting Lincoln as this radical abolitionist, even when it wasn't entirely true, Douglas might have actually helped Lincoln in the long run. How's that for a twist?
I am intrigued. How so?
Think about it. By exaggerating Lincoln's stance on slavery, Douglas forced Lincoln to refine his own arguments, to articulate a more principled, even radical position.
Because when someone's accusing you of something constantly, eventually you start to embrace it.
In a way, yeah. And remember, this is the same Lincoln who, a few years later, will famously declare, "A house divided against itself cannot stand."
You're saying Douglas basically handed Lincoln the very arguments that would help him win the presidency.
Unintentionally, of course, but yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? But let's not forget, we're still in the thick of this Freeport debate.
And we've still got a whole nother layer to unravel.
One that I think reveals a lot about how both Lincoln and Douglas use the racial anxieties of their time to score political points.
Oh yeah, this is where things always get
Yeah.
interesting. And I'm using that term loosely.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. So Douglas, he brings up this seemingly insignificant detail about Lincoln riding in a carriage. Now, keep in mind, the carriage itself isn't important.
It's who's driving and who's inside that matters.
Bingo. Lincoln was riding in a carriage driven by a white man with Frederick Douglass and his family inside.
Okay, and?
And this is 1858, my friend. Segregation is the law in many parts of the country. Racial mixing like this, it was frowned upon, especially in the South.
So Douglas is using this to paint Lincoln as some sort of radical egalitarian, someone who wants black people to be socially equal with whites.
Precisely. It's a shrewd tactic, really, because even many people who opposed slavery back then weren't quite ready to embrace racial equality. It's a good reminder that these debates, they weren't just about policy, they were about perception.
About image. About tapping into those deep-seated anxieties of the time.
Exactly. It's a reminder that political debates are often about much more than the issues themselves.
It's kind of chilling when you think about it, how these seemingly small, insignificant details can be weaponized like that.
It's a good reminder that words have power, and they can be used to exploit people's fears and prejudices just as easily as they can be used to inspire and uplift.
So true. But let's zoom out for a second. We've covered a lot of ground here.
Lincoln's carefully crafted responses, Douglas's political maneuvering, the ways in which race factored into all of this.
It's been quite a ride. But what are the big takeaways here? Why does this Freeport debate still matter today?
For me, one of the biggest takeaways is that Lincoln was a far more savvy politician than he sometimes gets credit for. We tend to put him on a pedestal.
The great emancipator, the man who saved the Union.
Right, and he was all of those things. But at Freeport, we see a different side of Lincoln, a more calculating side. He's playing chess, not checkers.
I like that.
He's thinking several moves ahead, weighing every word, trying to appeal to a broad spectrum of voters without alienating anyone irrevocably.
All while staying true to his core values.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was he able to do that? Or did he have to compromise some of his principles to achieve his ultimate goal?
Which, let's not forget, was to prevent the spread of slavery.
Exactly. And that's a question we can all relate to on some level, right? Trying to stay true to our values while navigating the messy realities of the world. It's never easy.
Speaking of messy realities, anything else about this debate stand out to you?
You know, it really underscores the power of rhetoric. The way these men use language, the way they frame the issues, it has a tremendous impact on how people understand and interpret what's being said. A single word, a carefully chosen phrase, can completely change the entire narrative.
Like that thing with the carriage. Such a seemingly insignificant detail, but it speaks volumes about the racial dynamics of the time.
And it reminds us that political debates are often won and lost, not on the strength of the arguments themselves, but on the emotions they evoke. The stories they tell.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Freeport debate, what's a final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I think it's important to remember that we often view historical figures as one-dimensional. But here, we see Lincoln and Douglas in all their complexity, grappling with an issue that would ultimately tear the nation apart.
And they had no way of knowing how it would all end.
Exactly. So, as you continue to explore this pivotal period in American history, I want you to consider this. Was Lincoln being politically savvy or morally compromising in his Freeport answers? Was he justified in putting political expediency ahead of his personal convictions?
There's no easy answer. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all.
Because it reminds us that history is rarely black and white. It's full of these fascinating gray areas that force us to think critically about the past and how it continues to shape our present.
And on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another journey into the heart of history.